I'm going to talk about partnerships for affordable housing in England, and I say England because the other constituent parts of the UK, so Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, have slightly different laws, and I'm going to focus specifically on London. And you'll see some of the material that I presented the other day, but there's not that much overlap, so bear with me. So I'll give you a very quick history of social and affordable housing in England. I'll talk a bit about what that slippery word affordable means, and then ask why we should even be thinking about partnerships and what kind of partnerships are happening in England. So traditionally in England, social housing and affordable housing were pretty much synonymous. Social housing was owned by local authorities and commonly known as council housing, because local authorities are also, the name of them is local councils, they don't call them municipalities, or by housing associations, which you're all familiar with. It was rented, almost always rented, not owner-occupied, rented at below market prices to low-income households, and there was lifetime tenure security. So once you moved into a social home, you could stay there until you died, and there was no revisiting the eligibility criteria. So if you got a job and your income went up or your circumstances changed, that didn't have any effect on your ability to stay. So that was the sort of affordable tenure. Then you have owner occupation at market prices, which is always has been the majority tenure in England for at least 50 years, and currently in England as a whole stands at about 63%. And private renting at market rents. And that has been growing very rapidly in the last 25 years in England, whereas owner occupation has been declining slowly and social renting has been declining more. So I showed these slides the other night. These are a quick run through of social housing provision in London. These are the conditions that you found in sort of the 1860s and the 1870s that gave rise to the recognition of the need to provide better housing conditions for working people. This is a slum street not very far from my office in central London. All of these streets were demolished as a kind of big road widening program, and also to get rid of these terrible slums. And the first efforts at building good quality affordable homes were not carried out by local authorities, but rather by private philanthropists. And this is a picture of Peabody Estate. George Peabody was one of the early, very generous philanthropists who built lots of social housing in London, and many of these estates with their very distinctive brick architecture still stand. In fact, there's a lot of them around LSE, and if you come to London, I'll take you around and show you some nice Peabody estates. Actually, that one is in Chelsea. This is a contemporary picture from the 19th century, but the estate is still there in some of the most expensive real estate in London. This is the first council estate. This was built in 1890 in Shoreditch in East London, a kind of iconic design radiating out from a central circular park. Very beautiful and much visited by architects, the Boundary Estate. This is what people more typically think of as social housing if you talk about council housing in the UK. This is in South London, the Brandon Estate. And you can see some similarities probably with Grenfell Tower in the kind of type of construction, towers in a kind of parkland setting with signs saying no ball games and no playing and stuff. So these were the first stories over 15, first towers over 15 stories to be built by the London County Council, and they were considered, extraordinarily ambitious at the time, but of course now that's kind of medium-rise housing, really. So then came Mrs. Thatcher. She brought in a number of policies to radically expand home ownership. She wanted a property-owning democracy, and she gave council tenants, so local authority tenants, the right to buy their homes at a discount, and the amount of the discount was very generous. It depended on how long you'd been living in the house, and it kind of has varied over time, but at the most generous, the discounts were 70% or something. There were also ballots on council estates asking the tenants whether they wanted the ownership of the estates to pass to housing associations and to be taken out of council control. And in many local authorities that did happen. And there were legal restrictions on council's ability to construct new social homes because the UK is a very, very centralized system of government. Unlike a federal system where the subnational levels of government have their own decision-making power over taxes and housing policies, and different cities can have different policies on rent control and so on in the States. In Britain, that is completely different. Local authorities can only do exactly those things that government allows them to do. And if government changes its mind and says you can't do those things anymore, that's it. They can't do it. So Mrs. Thatcher said no more building of social housing by local authorities, and it stopped. Only housing associations were required to build. So it led to a complete reshaping of the social housing landscape. And you can see that in this chart. This is who was building new homes from 1946 to now. The gray is local authorities. The blue is private developers, and the orange is housing associations. So you can see that in the late 80s and early 90s, local authority construction just petered out and stopped, and housing associations carried on with what social construction there was, but at much lower levels than had been the case in the 60s and 70s, which was kind of the heyday of local authority house building. So this is the kind of thing that is being built now in terms of new affordable housing. This is a mixed tenure development. It's done by a partnership between a housing association and a private developer, and it's won lots of awards. So this is, I don't know the exact split, it's probably about 25% social housing and 75% market, but the units are identical, and there's no pour doors or anything. So this is kind of seen as an example of best practice. Right, so I'll say a bit about what we mean when we talk about affordable housing, because that has become a very contentious term in England. So one possibility, the kind of common sense meaning of the word, is housing payments that a household can cover without causing difficulty. So this is implicitly the definition in most countries, and it's what kind of people mean when they're talking about it in common usage. And the rule of thumb is usually 35% of income is affordable. But another possibility, and the one that's enshrined in the legislation in England, is housing that is cheaper than the market price. And the current definition of affordable housing, affordable rental housing in England, is housing that rents at up to 80% of market rents in the local area. So this approach is often used for intermediate housing. Not all the affordable rental housing that's produced does cost 80% of market rents. The exact percentage is a matter for negotiation between the local authority and the developer, and some will agree 60% of market rent, or 10% at 80% of market rent, 20% at 60, and so on. So you have these very, very complicated constellations of different kinds of affordable housing and different qualifications for living in the different types of housing. So there are, back in the 60s and 70s, there was basically only social rented housing and market housing, but now we have a number of different varieties of officially recognized affordable housing that target different segments of the market. Social rented housing is still targeted at the lowest income households, but you have shared ownership, which is designed to help households get into property ownership who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford to. They buy a proportion of the home, usually 25%, and pay rent on the rest, and then they can increase their share as time goes by. Shared equity, which is a slightly different variety of that, and various rental products that this is only a partial list, there are many more. So they're all cheaper than market, but not necessarily genuinely affordable for low-income households. So this is, shows you the change in the last decade of the kind of affordable homes that are being built. So the dark blue bar at the top is affordable home ownership, and that has gone down a bit over the last 10 years. But the light blue bar at the bottom, that's social rented housing. And you can see that construction of new social rented housing has almost disappeared. It's what we're building now is other types of affordable that are generally less affordable than social. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about partnership. Why should we talk about partnership? Well, there's a very strong political imperative to build new affordable housing, especially in London. The housing crisis in London and the need for affordable housing is the top political issue in London at the moment, and Mayor Sadiq Khan has said that it is his top priority is to build more affordable housing. Many local authorities, and just to say that in London, the overall metropolitan mayor is Sadiq Khan, and he is the head of an organization called the Greater London Authority, but the planning authorities for London, the local governments, are the 32 London boroughs and the City of London, and they are the ones that make planning decisions, that own council houses, and that have responsibility for housing homeless families. So many local authorities do own land. Some of them own a lot of land, but since Mrs. Thatcher, they have lost the development and design expertise. They no longer have departments of architects. They no longer have construction capacity and so on. And until recently, this has now changed, but until recently, central government regulations tied their hands and made it almost impossible for them to build any new homes. There are other public landowners, some of which have very big portfolios of land, and they include transport authorities. Transport for London is the organization that runs the tube network, the subways in London, and some of the trains. Prisons, there's some actually very, very big prisons close to inner London, and hospitals, which are in the UK, they are a public body because we have a National Health Service, and some of the hospitals have a lot of land. So the obvious organizations to partner up with these landowners and build some affordable housing are housing associations. These are mostly charitable organizations whose mission is to provide housing. They range from the tiny with 6 or 7 little homes for seniors in some village to the very enormous. And there has been a wave of consolidation in the last 10 years that has led to some really big players. Clarion owns 125,000 homes across the whole country. Notting Hill Genesis owns 110,000 and builds 11,000 homes a year. If you look at the top 10 house builders in the UK, about 3 or 4 of them are housing associations, and they build market housing to take the profits and subsidize their affordable housing. So housing associations are the obvious partner, and there's a perhaps less obvious partner, which is for-profit developers. But this is actually a really important part of the system in England. They are required to build affordable homes as a condition of getting planning permission. You don't, in the UK, have the right, if you own a plot of land, you'd have no right to build on that. That's not part of your ownership package. You can only build on it if you get planning permission from the local authority, and the local authority can demand certain conditions, and what they demand is that you provide some affordable housing. So in London, the policy is that for any development of over 10 units, the expectation is that at least 35% of the units will be affordable. And if that is being built on public land, it's 50%. So the developers are required to build this affordable housing, but they don't keep it. They sell it on to a housing association who manages it. So that once they built it and sold it, they wash their hands of it. They're not involved anymore. So in that sense, they're not really partners in the longer term. This Section 106 housing, that's the name of the legislation that covers it, has no financial cost to the local authority, and it creates mixed communities because almost always the requirement is that affordable housing be on the same site as the market housing, or next door sometimes, but very rarely will they allow it to be in a separate site. What it does require, though, is that the profits from the market housing be enough to cover the cost of the affordable housing. So what you end up with is what they call a kind of dumbbell provision, where you have a lot of really expensive units and some cheap units, but nothing in the middle. So this chart shows you how important Section 106 is, which is this condition of planning permission. In England, I think this was last year, it was the most recent figures anyway, almost half of the new affordable housing produced came through Section 106 without grant. That means that there was no government subsidy involved. It was purely paid for out of developer profits. The next biggest source was housing associations who got some grant, and then there are some other sources there. Okay, I'll give you a few quick examples of partnerships in action, and then conclude. So this is in Frimley in Surrey. I like this one because a friend of mine was the chief executive of this hospital when this deal was concluded. Frimley is a very expensive suburban area to the southwest of London. Generally the southwest of London, the southwester you go, the posher it gets. So this is, even though it's outside of London, it's a very expensive area. The NHS, the National Health Service, faces serious problems of affordability for its workers in London and in the surrounding areas, because they get the same pay no matter where they work in the country. Actually, there's a little London supplement, but it's not very much. But they face very much higher housing costs if they're in these areas. So Frimley Hospital paired up with Thames Valley Housing Association to convert some property that it owned into homes, some of which were for market sale, and some of which went to local nurses and doctors, which I thought was interesting, that even medical doctors cannot afford the price of market housing in these areas. So this is the housing they produced. I have to say I don't think it's tremendously architecturally distinguished, but you know, it looks fine. Okay. Fine. Okay, this is, I mentioned that Transport for London owns quite a bit of land. They own, well, all the land along the railways, and then lots of land that was used for marshalling yards and storage and all kinds of stuff. They're one of London's biggest landowners. And Mayor Sadiq Khan, besides being the Mayor of London, he's the chairman of Transport for London. So he has told them, I expect you to use your spare land for affordable housing, which actually Transport for London's financial director was not that terribly thrilled about, because they could have got a lot more money by just selling it at market value. But okay, the mayor, that's what the mayor says. So he requires 50% affordable housing on TfL land. So TfL has done a framework agreement with 13 developers. The developers had, it was kind of a beauty contest. The developers had to pitch for why they should be one of TfL's developer partners, and 4 of those successful developers are housing associations. So then once they're in the framework, when TfL decides it's going to develop a particular plot, the framework partners can bid again for the opportunity to work on that site. The partners were required to have at least £100 million in net assets. So this, you know, this was not for the small fry. You had to be a pretty big organization to qualify. So this is one of the sites that's going to be starting development soon. This is Kidbrooke Station Square in southeast London. You can't see it there, but it's actually right next to a train station, and the partner here is a housing association. So those were some happy tales of partnership. Now I'll tell you a less happy tale. This is the story of the Haringey HDV. The London Borough of Haringey, which is in North London, partnered with Lend-Lease, the Australian developer, and they created a joint venture called the Haringey Development Vehicle. And what they agreed to do was that the London Borough was going to transfer ownership of a very big rundown council estate to this joint venture vehicle. And the joint venture was going to demolish the existing monotenure estate and rebuild it at 3 times the existing density, providing a mixed tenure scheme with new homes for all of the existing residents, plus lots of market housing and other facilities, retail, and so on. And they had signed the agreement to do this. This was a legal agreement, and the whole thing was going ahead. But there was very, very strong local opposition. It was branded social cleansing. The left-wing local branch of the Labour Party, which is called Momentum, took over, won the council elections in May, got control of Haringey Council, and said, we are going to pull out of this contract. So they have done that. They've pulled out of the contract. This is a slide from the Stop Haringey Development Vehicle campaign website. So they're saying they've been victoriously stopped social cleansing, but there are other things that they're still fighting. And unsurprisingly, day before yesterday, Lend-Lease announced that it is suing Haringey Council for £200 million to cover all the costs that it has already incurred in, going forward in good faith in what they thought was a admirable partnership. Okay, just the final few observations. So, to kind of trace back what has laid the foundations for these partnerships, you have to go back more than 100 years. We have 100 years of history and lots of subsidy that have gone into the housing association sector and have created really, at the top level, things that are almost indistinguishable from big profit-making house builders, but they are of a size and level of expertise that they can partner with any of the big local authorities in the country. The biggest housing associations are major house builders in the market sector as well. And we did a little exercise a few months ago where we looked at the websites of the 15 biggest housing associations in the country to see if you didn't know that they were a housing association, would you be able to tell from their website? And in many cases, no, you wouldn't. They just look like a house builder's website. So, so that's something that you can't create overnight. That's very path dependent. What about mixed communities? Well, on older estates, mixed communities, the estates that were originally single tenure estates, mixed communities have evolved over time, partly through the right to buy on council estates. Now, right to buy did not apply to housing association estates, although some housing associations did it voluntarily. So the single tenure estates that you find out there now are mostly historic housing association estates, like the Peabody estates are all single tenure. Planning policy requires basically mixed tenure on all new developments. And I would say that politically in London, there's no dispute about that. It's just absolutely assumed that that is going to be the case. If anything, as we saw with the Haringey Development Vehicle, the push is for 100% affordable rather than 100% market. No, it would be unthinkable to allow big schemes that were 100% market. So in conclusion, the partnerships that have evolved organically. There was never a specific kind of government policy to encourage partnerships. They came about because the partners needed each other. The local authorities needed development expertise, the housing associations needed land, and the implicit subsidy of getting that land for less than market value, maybe. The arrangements require really clear rules and goodwill, because the partners don't necessarily have interests that are completely aligned. Housing is the main priority of housing associations, obviously, but not necessarily of other stakeholders. It's actually the example I showed you of Brimley Hospital, where the NHS has teamed up with a housing association. It's one of the very few that has happened, even though it seems like a no-brainer, because hospitals own land, their workers face big housing affordability problems. Housing associations are happy to come in and build on that land, but they have not been able to make it work in very many places, because actually hospitals, their main driver is treating sick people, not building housing. So even things that seem like a win-win situation may not happen. And finally, the main actors, those of us like those of us in this room, may see partnerships as something that brings great benefits and something that's definitely worth pursuing, but we cannot assume that the general public necessarily sees it that way. So I think maybe in cases like what went on in Haringey, actually one can debate the merits of that particular structure, but there needs to be a better job of explaining what's going on, because in the past it was just council housing. It was very clear, local authority owned it, you lived there for as long as you wanted, but now the picture is a lot more complex, and I think it's not necessarily understood outside the experts. Thank you.